Good evening, this is Ben. Yeah, it's evening for once. And that's Ben, my name, not Ben, the linking verb. We have a video I wanted to respond to from the number one janitor, I guess, or is it the one janitor, but probably the number one janitor. And it says, my question for this. And his question was, what is it about religion that makes you okay with suspending everything you otherwise believe to be true about the universe? And he, follows that up to refine it a little bit. What he says is, what is it that makes you believe that in this case only, it's possible for an all-powerful, invisible, sentient being to exist? Now, he admits an assumption, that such a being, God, what the theists, would obviously believe in, is illogical and scientifically invalid. Now, my question, that I want to raise is, of course, is God illogical and unscientific? That question at least needs to be asked before we, jump ahead. I mean, for some people that's a moot question because they already say yes, and it doesn't matter. Of course, unscientific is vague, and, he said that a common response to this question he gets is, you can't prove there's no God. And what he claims is that, if science applies, then no, you can prove there's no God. In the same way that you would prove that, animals need food or something like that, as you gave an example. I'm not real sure exactly what this meant, and that doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means I don't know where to go. I'm not real sure where he's going. Because not because there's nowhere to go, but because there's different ways to go with that. So what I'll just do is assume he meant in like a traditional David Hume sense, where David Hume said that he had an argument against miracles, and he said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and you can't violate the laws of nature, therefore miracles don't happen, and things such as that. And the issue with that argument, and perhaps the issue with number one janitor, is that the laws of nature are not necessarily what we say they are. And that's the problem. You can't violate, the actual laws of nature. In other words, these are descriptions of the true laws of nature would be true descriptions of what our universe is. And so for something to take place in our universe, it would have to take place according to the actual laws of nature that define what that universe is, or else it didn't really by definition take place in that universe. In other words, you can't, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say, the examples are dumb. But the point is that, let's say the universe is defined as you can't make water into wine. Well, if someone makes water into wine, then by definition of what our universe is, if that's truly a law of our universe, is a definition of how our universe works and what it is, then that couldn't have taken place in our universe. It would have taken place in some other universe or something like that. But the problem with this line of reasoning is, of course, that we do not necessarily know what the real laws of our universe are. In fact, science is a key objective is to constantly update with better observations exactly what they are. So all sorts of laws, get rewritten. For example, the law of conservation of mass and the law of conservation of energy stood for so long until, now we're at E equals mc squared, where lo and behold, the mass in the universe is not necessarily conserved, and the energy in the universe is not necessarily conserved. The mass energy, that mass can turn into energy. I mean, that's just an example. And the old experiments for conservation of mass were that no matter what you did, the mass in was the mass out, and not anymore. Now they measured a loss of mass, and they measured an energy increase equal to the mass lost times the speed of light squared. And so there was, voila, confirmation of the theory. Now, these other God is illogical issues, he raised the issue, God is illogical because, I'm just summarizing, because he can't build an indestructible wall and also destroy it. Now, what we have here is the very old omnipotence paradox. And the most classic example of this is, can God create a rock that, God could not lift? In other words, I'll say it again, can God create a rock that God cannot lift? Or, as he says here, God can't build an indestructible wall and also destroy it. Okay, what is this question? Let's look at it. The question really boils down to, if we can simplify it as much as possible and ask the nitty-gritty of, because we have these different examples, the different way of wording it. The wall, rock, can, insoluble force, can God, kill himself or something like that. So, or I think the other, even more classic question was, can God deny himself? Deny that God exists. But the issue here is, if we boil this down to as simple as we can God have the power of not having a power? That's really the most simple form of the question. Can God have the power of not having a power? And the simple response is that that is not a power. This is a meaningless question. To lack an ability is not an ability. The reason this question seems like it makes sense, it seems like it's meaningful, is because we put it in terms of us, making rocks. So, example, you or I can make a huge 2,000-pound cement block that neither you or I can lift. The fact that we can make it is not somehow power causing us not to be able to lift it. And this is the issue. It is precisely the lack of power of lifting 2,000-pound blocks that keep us from lifting it. That was in place regardless of whether or not we bothered to create the block. Okay, so again, to lack an ability is not an ability, and God, to have the power of not having a power is not a power. That's a meaningless question. Okay, now omnipresence. So in other words, this is not an illogical God. It's not God who's illogical here. It's the question that's illogical. It's okay. Omnipresence, and as far as I could tell, it was just sort of an assertion that, as far as I know, there's nothing that can occupy more than one space. And I think he said, much less all space. And again, I'll have to question this. Perhaps something can occupy more than one space. In fact, if God exists, shouldn't we expect God to be unique to everything else in the universe? Why should we expect God to be, he has the qualities of this other thing in the universe? In fact, that's what the word holy means. He's unlike anything else. Omniscience. And now, follow me here. If I wrote down what he said right, he said presumably that would include knowing how to create reality. But how is that even possible when reality is required beforehand to even exist, and to create it? Now, the issue here is that what has been equated is knowledge and power, and they are equitable. In other words, if you know how to do everything, you can do everything. And so if God has all knowledge and he has all power, but this omniscience paradox really says, well, if God knows everything, then he knows how to do this, and he has this power, and he has this omnipotence. And so in other words, this is just the same omnipotence paradox that we faced before. Is just saying that, I could say, like the other one, he said, God can't build, if God has all power, can he build an indestructible wall and also destroy it? Well, again, I could reword that as an omniscience paradox and simply say, if God has all knowledge, then he knows how to build an indestructible wall and also destroy it. So in other words, this omniscience paradox is just knowing how to have and power, and it's just an omnipotence paradox all over again. And the same response, it's just the old, can God have the ability of not having ability? And then he says, it does matter if God exists. I 100% agree. And the real question here, is why do people say this? I think people say this because they don't want to be challenged, and because they're confused about what they believe, and they think that it is, they prefer to talk about it with other people who they feel pretty sure already agree with them. In fact, church can become that. And then, of course, the classic paradox, which is older than the omnipotence paradox, as far as we know. Why is there still suffering in the world? Or, again, how do we boil this down in the simplest form? Either evil exists or God exists, but it cannot be both. Okay? And so to respond to this very ancient question, could God have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to exist? Again, I'll repeat it. Could God have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to exist? Okay? I just want to introduce that as an option that at least would need to be checked out. Okay? So let's check it out. What could be a morally sufficient reason? Perhaps letting you control your life. We call it freedom, but ultimately it's about control. It's about, perhaps God values the fact that you run your life. And He values you as someone who, makes choices, and He thinks your choices are important and significant. And in fact, this would be the whole reason for punishing, evil. If God didn't punish evil, then He would say, in essence, that what you do does not matter to me. So the fact that He allows it to exist, and the fact that He punishes it, or there's repercussions, and the fact that He lets us have some control over our world, that we don't just want to do evil and cause suffering and cause destruction in this world and not happen. Now, some people sometimes raise the question, well, are the percentages off? It's just too much evil here and not enough there. And again, and say that, well, God didn't have to go that far. And again, the issue is, there's no way to assert that that was too much or this was not enough, because we're talking about an overarching plan over the whole universe. And, who knows until we get to the end of time. Yeah, so there. We'll leave it with that. Thank you and good night.